Hello, and welcome to Label Sessions Presents. Label Sessions is a global platform that connects you to the best advice for the most interesting people, whether you want advice, mentoring, or ideas. I'm Josh Nixon, content producer for Label Sessions. In this episode, Nick Sherrard of Label Sessions talks to Pat Kane. Pat is a creative innovator whose reach spans music, journalism, and now the future. From his book, The Play Ethic, he's bridged the gap between play and innovation, lending his mind to brands like Lego and Nokia, to organisations in the Scottish Government and the BBC. As he describes himself, he is incurably, inescapably interested in the new, the original, and the groundbreaking. Nick talks to him to find out more.
Excellent. So, Pat, great to have you with us. And I'm glad I don't have to introduce you, because I said to you before, you do so many different things. It's quite hard to introduce you without lots of slashes or commas or all the different things. How would you describe yourself and what you do today?
Well, I'm kind of fated to be the guy that exemplifies that hated term, creative. And I sometimes say I'm the guy who my mother sat down in front of a 10-finger touch typing course in 1976. And that's the best thing that ever happened to me, because it meant I was able to jump from writing lyrics to doing radio shows, to doing journalism, to doing curating, to updating myself on the next Compaq or laptop. So I'm a kind of generally capable semiotic warrior, let's call it that. I'm trained in literary criticism and semiotics and film studies and TV studies from my university days, and that's basically my basic training, is to look at culture against the grain, take it apart, put it back together again, see if there's something in the ruins that indicates something's coming around the corner, and I think I've been doing that since I was before 17 years old, but it came to a focus when I was at college, university, and finding out about how deep cultural creativity goes in people. And then basically working wise, I've always just wanted to surround myself with those kinds of people and see what we can do together. So that whether that's a band, or whether that's an editorial floor in a newspaper, or whether that's Skunk Works in a large corporation, or whether it's curating the 2022 festival, or doing things like Future Fest, which I did for Nesta. All of it is about hanging out with similarly creative people, putting dents in the universe.
So it's interesting. So the way you describe it all seems beautifully joined up. I think a lot of other people might see musician, futurist, author, these as quite different scenes. Does it feel like that, or does it, the way you're expressing it, it feels like it's one continuous journey?
There's a couple of fundamentals. I mean, I think one of the fundamentals would be having a kind of unalienated relationship to technology, or an expressive relationship to technology, and sort of expecting that that's what tech will do, in the sense of it not just being efficient, but generating possibilities. I mean, my favorite story in this is when the first time we came upon a sampler in New York in 1987. And the reason why we had to use it was because the horn section that we'd used the day before, which was Tom Waits' horn section, the Uptown Horns, had all gotten drunk, and so couldn't make the second half of the session the next day. And so an engineer came in with this gigantic box and said, let's use this. We can copy them and stack them up. It's called a sampler. And that was in 87. So the fact that we live in a kind of digital chaos, of copying and mixing and morphing and shaping, which sort of fell upon us in the mid-90s, we were already, as musicians, using this kind of technology, simulatory technology, to kind of work out creative problems, to get great results. And you can go all the way back with that. You can go all the way back into 20th century music history to have that relationship. Sinatra cradling the microphone closer to his face so that he could produce this inhuman effect of intimacy. So one of your questions in advance was, how does music connect up with thinking about the future or thinking about creativity? I think it's one of these master skills. Other people, when Malcolm Gladwell was talking about outliers and people doing their 10,000 hours, so certainly I've certainly counted up more than 10,000 hours when I apply myself to music. But I think that idea that Bill Gates sitting in a computer room just battering away at coding gives him a creative advantage. I think that's what music has done in my life for the last 45 years. Is it's given me, number one, this dynamic, creative, unalienated relationship with new technologies for fun, profit, and community. And I'm very appreciative of that.
It's interesting because it's a kind of way of interacting with the idea of planning, of foresight and the future and tech, which is really powerful, but also quite different to the way a lot of people do it currently. There is a kind of scene of futurism and foresight that's very analytical, and it's not necessarily, well, it's not seen as a creative enterprise. It's seen as something that's a kind of almost a branch of economics in some areas. I mean, do you see that happening around you and think that's just a short-sighted way of doing it? Do you find that your practice opens up different avenues, or do you just ignore that kind of futurist scene that exists?
No, sure, but I mean, as a young sci-fi propeller head to this very day, I think science fiction is a kind of pop cultural futurism often, and it's joy driven. You want your genre to deliver your technological buzz in your alternative society, so it has that kind of cognitive fun about it. So I've always been proud of having music in my life. I've always had science fiction in my life. But there's two aspects to this. One would be those two William Gibson phrases. You probably know the one I'm going to say, which is the future is here. It's not evenly distributed. But there's another one. He says the street has its uses. So that when things become sort of banal and unusable, and people are starting to use them to create scenes or environments or situations, that's when the technology is bringing the future into the present. I mean, ChatGPT being the classic example of a way in which a human-centered interface brings massive, rebarbative, abstract computational capacity onto your phone at the bus stop. I mean, to me, that sense of the magical and the banal and in everyday, again, is very pop music. Again, is very science fiction. We're a very science fiction culture. But I think it's a warmer way to think about how novelty and the new emerges in the everyday than to sit down with your foresight and your four-quadrant analysis and your matrix and try to kind of extrapolate. I think often, and certainly I think there's a kind of everyday futurism at the moment when you're a social media user. People are tying out futures, whether they compose them through Midjourney or whether they do them in a stunt or whether they even try to create a whole new business model through immediate social media use. It's a very playful, to coin a word, environment at the moment. There's lots of malleability and possibility in all directions. And I think the mentality, I think the one last thing I would say about the salience of pop music is I actually did a piece the other week on the top 10 downloads of 2023, music downloads so far. Did a wee bit of a semantic analysis of them. 8 of them are about either intense love or intensely falling out of love or having intense sex. I think one of them was about mental illness, and I can't remember what the 10th one was. I think it was another kind of bit of braggadocio. But that's what pop music is, kind of emotionally utopian, and it's elemental. There's something evolutionary biology being communicated in the semantics of pop songs, day in, day out, year in, year out, decade in, decade out. So to tap into that kind of fundamental species optimism of being human, particularly in this environment, Nick, is again a very helpful resource, and I would propose it as a helpful resource to people abroad.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think that especially if you look at AI, the only way to understand it is to play with it and to see how people are playing with it in practice. It's an interesting time around all of that. I want to pick up on this idea of playfulness. So it just because it's such a key thing for you, and some people listening to this will have read Play Ethic. I know that because lots of people around the label at different points have referenced it.
Oh, that's nice. Nice.
And I think for a lot of them, for people that don't know the book, it was a grand project, right? Because it was taking play more seriously across a whole range of things, from education to science.
And business as well.
Yeah, exactly, and business as well. But How did that come? Is that something that's always been within you as a creative? You've always kind of taken that seriously and it gradually grew from there? Or was there a moment when you thought, actually, play is a bigger part of my projects?
Yes. I think the original phrase, the play ethic, was a kind of riff on, for sociology fans, Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic, or the Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And I was just doing a bit of riffing and saying, well, what would the spirit of informationalism be? This is around about the mid-90s, as in what would the spirit of the information society as opposed to the industrial society be? And the original term I came up with was the New Age ethic and the spirit of informationalism. And I thought, no, that's not going to work. But what would it mean to be talking about play? Now, what I sort of realized, even when I began to start my research, is that was in 1997. Book came out in 2004. That was the height of New Labour, and so the whole idea that there could be a new Labour, what would that new Labour be? Would it be play? And what would play mean in that circumstance was broiling around in my head. That was the time as well when sort of creative industries was invented as a kind of category, I think, by Chris Smith, as a sort of government category, as a thing to manage in a nation. But the thing about play is that it's a sort of crossroads. It's a conduit to so many different aspects of the human condition. And one of the things I loved about it was that it was both descriptive of where we were in the late 90s and early 2000s, with a burgeoning digital culture, with games culture beginning to kind of expand and explore, music already sort of dominating the mainstream discussion, playful tools becoming more available to people in terms of the social media beginning to kind of kick off, playing with knowledge, using Google just to kind of completely follow your nose and your interests and your instincts. So the actual posh word ontological reality that I was in was malleable and playful, and that as a result of digitality, and I think that persists right up to the present. Right up to the present. Super Musk. Elon Musk is the kind of super player of the moment. I don't want to call him Super Musk. That would be a disaster.
It was a few years ago. He was like an entrepreneur from the Marvel universe, this kind of all-seeing thing, where he's now kind of this kind of shriveled, sort of ugly figure in our culture now.
Well, he's no doubt ready to regenerate himself. But,
sure.
The one thing you can say about Elon Musk today, as a consequence of thinking about play over the last 20 years, is that he's an advert for its virtue. Just in terms of his ability to kind of turn imagination into reality and believe that he has the boldness to do it. And also he partakes of the kind of the essence of the playful mentality, which is to take matter lightly, not to ignore matter, not to project fantasy on it, but to presume that you can do things with it. And he's drenched in science fiction, was talking the other day before his apart fight with Zuckerberg, that the reality of the universe bends towards the most entertaining outcome, and the most entertaining outcome is the most likely. So no matter what, I have my problems with him on every single level, politically, economically, and even technologically. But I would be a churl to deny that he is driven by a play ethic, or at least a ludic ethic, and he's the outcome of a kind of a generation that of entrepreneurs and innovators that have brought play into the core of the way that they see themselves and that they see the world. Creative destruction is almost, in terms of the Schumpeterian model of entrepreneurship, is almost exactly what happens in play from birth. Anyway, the child plays with things, pulls them together, puts them back together, and thereby understands the world. And I thought in 1997 to 2004, when I brought out the book, I thought that it was going to be the secret power of the mid-20s. And I think I've been proved right. And I think there was a meme or an axiom that I've sent out called play is to 21st century what work was to the 20th. Play is a matter of knowing, doing, and creating value. And I think the environment would prove me completely right. Except now the things are starting to play with us when it comes to AI, which is a completely different frontier as well.
Yeah, that is a big point. And there's an interesting thing there as well, I think, in terms of the times, because actually it's interesting when you look back at play ethic now, is that one of the things it was responding to in the UK was the kind of work ethic aspect of New Labour, and that kind of sense of, trying to put a frame of work around the arts and around the creative scene. Also for the kind of innovation community that might be listening to this as well a lot, it was also when design thinking was starting to come through much more heavily.
That's right. IDEO,
kind of
IDEO
process.
And people like this. Yeah,
exactly. Which again was a similar kind of ethos around the whole thing. Of we can take these kind of messy processes and we can make it very neat, and we can make it something that people understand in a work frame, and we can make the individuals less important to it, so it all becomes repeatable. Whereas now on all levels, it feels like that kind of world is at least less effective, because it doesn't seem like the way you're going to explore this new world that's coming, and especially to get any of the value from it, either in a kind of classic business sense or in terms of just making things possible sense.
Well, sure. I mean, I did think quite deeply in the book, and the whole work play distinction I tried to break down, and I tried to, instead of the whole thing that was current at the time of the book was the idea of work-life balance, which is painfully schizophrenic, right? At one side, and also it renders active work as something you hate to do, and active life is something you'd prefer to do. So you're in this kind of dichotomous schizoid kind of situation. Whereas I was thinking, imagine if we managed to grasp the productive and wealth potential of automation and other kinds of robotized technologies, and lived in a play-care continuum as opposed to a work-life balance. And so play being how we respond to possibilities, and care being how we respond to limitations and exhaustions. And when you fall off the tightrope and hit the trampoline, is play and care a set of polarities that might work for us if we manage to get a certain distance from material necessity? Again, I think you can see in the Zs and the alphas a kind of balance between play and care, and a bit of a collapse in the work ethic, or at least a collapse in the idea that this particular job and this particular career and this particular professional occupation is going to map out a narrative for you going forward. Whereas I would say that they are very interested in care, certainly interested in self-care, interested in healthcare, interested in mental care, care of their friends, their scenes, their environment, and they're also straightforwardly interested in play, and not just in trivial ways. I think the whole culture around crypto and Web3 has been self-consciously playful, and I don't think that's I don't think that's an accident. I think that comes out of games culture and how people have been playing with currencies and values in games culture. But the rubber hit the road when it's come to austerity and cost of living crisis. I think I was reasonably prophetic there, reasonably.
This podcast is brought to you by Label Sessions, the global platform that connects you to the best advice from the most interesting people. Around the world, we work with brands to connect their people to true leaders, just like the people you hear on this podcast, for live sessions of advice, mentoring, or sometimes to collaborate on ideas. To find out more, visit labelsessions.com and book in for a demo with our team.
I want to pick up on a thing here as well. So one of the things that's interesting in the work that we do at the Label Sessions is you sort of see people and talk about why things are happening in different places. And one thing you've already picked up on, which we come across so consistently, we need to kind of draw out the data, is that people that are making things happen in all kinds of walks of life just now are sci-fi nerds at some point in their life. Like this is the way in which we actually explore the future, and there's a bunch of stuff that comes from it. The second thing, though, is also people, especially people that are really occupied with thinking about what comes next and foresight and futurism, is people realizing that actually the geographic place they are is giving them sometimes an advantage into seeing certain things coming. For you, how does that feel? So you've been based out, the one thing that's been constant during this time, you've been based out of the unit of the UK, at least, sometimes Scotland, sometimes London. Do you feel that influences the way you think about what's next, or the kind of the way you think about what's just happened as well in terms of the last few years of digital?
Well, I mean, to be honest, another factor in this is that I have had a long-term relationship with Indonesian Buddhist in my life. So I live with a different again, to use the posh words, ontology and epistemology about reality, day in, day out. And I speak as a resolute scientific materialist. So I encounter the idea that not just the progress of a particular commercial and industrial or technological sector might be different, but that the way that you relate to other human beings might be different culturally across the world. The way that you think of reality being a sort of a dead or a lively process might be quite different. So I would say it's certainly being in post-imperial Britain, being in a Scotland that wants to kind of have a civic argument about nationalism as opposed to an ethnic argument about nationalism, and sees that as a tool to progress, it's certainly being part of this, I wouldn't say failing state, but certainly buckling state, makes you think about the limitations of modernity. Again, that's another big term. What I mean by that is that the model is bust for so many different reasons and for so many historical reasons, and that there is a lot to learn, from cultures that are not as philosophically Cartesian as our own. So the idea that the sovereign part grasping onto the world and shaping in a certain way is such an unspoken and unrecognized cultural conceptual fundamental for how we live on these islands and in Europe. And I'm totally intrigued and excited and interested to know what innovation comes out of, African energy, solar energy generating leapfrogging, or Confucian Jainist uses of surveillance network technology. What are the new social contracts that we have to be ready for, aided and abetted by certain kinds of technology, or supporting different kinds of technological relations, making things seem natural to themselves that seem unnatural or coercive or overly transparent or overly controlling. But I think there's some deep cultural fundamentals that we have to kind of think about when we think about innovation in different parts of the world these days. And I've never felt more like a kind of Westerner in that sense. But what I would say is that I think one of the things that play ethic and my study in play reminds us is that almost all the way, certainly from the Romantics, all the way through to the Surrealists, all the way through up to the Beats, then to the 60s and the counterculture, that there has been an internal critique of Western modernity, capitalist modernity, consumerist modernity, bureaucratic modernity from the inside, and that it has had good effects. It's pushed the system in certain directions. There's always been a countercultural response. What's brilliant about the book The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Vengro is that they say don't just imagine that counterculture existed, say since the 19th century Romantics. Imagine that it was there 10,000 years before the 10,000 years of agriculture that we've just gone through. And my number one intellectual firework of the last 12 months has been their conclusion in The Dawn of Everything, that the process which allows social forms and organizations and ways of doing things and ways of extracting value from the world, the one core thing that enables that to happen is ritual play. Ritual play is a way for people to, over this long 20,000 BC period, has been a way for people to test out new ways of living together and new ways of doing things and new ways of dealing with nature. So I'm like, thank you, ka-ching. The mallet has gone down on the fairground bell ringer and it's rung at the top. Thank you very much. I mean, they're philosophical and political anarchists, so that granted. But if their science is even half right, if their archaeology is even half right, we have been doing ritual play to create new niches in our social lives amongst other social creatures for a long, long, long time. And that's just the final bit that's really constantly fascinating me at the moment, is the biological and evolutionary aspect of play, the way that it connects us, not just mammal to mammal across species, but mammal to cephalopod, mammal to corvid, to crow. The play as a kind of a consequence of being a more complex animal. And that's the thing I'm really exploring at the moment when we're all trying to figure out how do we feel that we protect nature by identifying with it or loving it is one of the great psychological tricks that people are trying to play in the climate movement. But I think animals playing with each other and us playing with animals is a great way for us to sort of feel our creatureliness in a very playful and a very enjoyable and sensual and fun way. It's not the hair shirt, it's not the ecological hair shirt, it's the ecological parliament of community that we are actually part of when we see play with animals.
That's okay. I'm fascinated to start bringing this into some of the things we are doing soon. But one of the things I just want to just quickly sort of bring this to head around is one of the things that's interesting actually with your point around the counterculture, how it exists inside things. In a sense, it kind of exists inside lots of institutions just now. Actually, when we were advising people that either run companies or government departments or these kind of things, there's a sense of everything's up for question at the moment.
Good.
Yeah, exactly. But what advice do you have to people, I guess, because in terms of there's all this going on, you're then trying to put that yourself into action in terms of how you go forward. If you were advising a leader who's facing into some of these kind of questions, how do you start to take some of this into land and start to apply it or think about how you approach things next?
Well, I mean, my only gambit in this, which I think has ever had any kind of hearing, is to talk to business leaders about what they think the wellsprings of adaptability are for their organization/organism. Because if you look at an organization as an organism, what's one of the things I've been looking at over the last couple of years is the whole neuroscience of play and the sociobiology of play, the evolutionary psychology of play. But it goes really all the way down. An organism has to have room to play. And the reason why it does that is because organisms often get trapped into niches in nature. They get stuck in ruts, and they have to find a way to experiment how to get out of that rut, how to even see how they can get out of that rut, whether there are new fields or rich fields or beyond. And the organisms have to reserve a quanta of energy and wriggle room. The physicist Stuart Kauffman calls it the adjacent possible. There has to be an adjacent possible around an organization or an organism to enable it to survive in tough competitive environments by making moves that genuinely move you to newer fertile fields or newer, more fertile relationships with others. And that to me, that crosses over quite straightforwardly. I mean, I remember way back in the 90s, one would quote the Google 20% rule, which is the idea that many of their best products came from that process of a coder being allowed to play with their job on the job and coming up with things that then would feed into, I think Gmail was the classic outcome of that. Then they moved that to X, that whole facility to X, Google X being how can we have a 10X, 20X, 100X improvement, and often the only way you would get there is by living in science fiction, right? Is imagining something that was just preposterous and then trying to reverse engineer it in terms of the creativity of the organization. So I'm happy to hear that a lot of organizations are thinking that to be properly adaptive, to be able to respond to maybe exponentially changing circumstances, that they have to create a zone of play or a ground of play, I would often call it in the book. There's a beautiful phrase by the Russian educational psychologist Vygotsky. It's geeky, but it's perfect because he says play requires a proximal zone of development, a ZPD, a proximal zone of development. So you need wriggle room, you need play in your own systems for possibilities to come through. And then in terms of leadership, I think you need to be thinking of yourself as, the most enabling parent, who's secured the playground, who allows for a certain amount of play, but makes the play not fatal, not if injurious, then copable with. This is the great, one of the loveliest lessons for leaders from biology is that, strictly speaking, play is like sex and sleep and dreaming. Play should be maladaptive. You open yourself out to injury, you waste energy, you do things that don't seem to have any clear utility, and yet there it is, preeminently as part of the human condition. But it is adaptive, but it's not adaptive in that strict survival sense for social imaginative networked, complex creatures, you need zones of experiment and prototype to survive and thrive, to propagate your genes. So I think it's a straightforward organization crossover. It's at least worth exploring. And the other thing I would say as well is that what's the interest I've often been brought in to talk to organizations about creativity and innovation. And I say, you've pulled me in to talk about play. And really there's a sequence here. There's play, playfulness, creativity, innovation. Innovation is kind of at the end of the process. And play is at the beginning, because what you're dealing with is you're dealing with your workforce or your colleagues as mammalian creatures. You know, he who must play cannot play, as James Cars's, the theologian's great injunction. So play is an indicator of autonomy. It's one of the best indicators of autonomy. And so if you want to increase autonomy in your colleagues and workforce, talk about play and talk about the conditions of play. If you don't. But that's in terms of people's the war for talent, in terms of people's motivation to be in an organization. To me, an organization that gets the basic science of play is going to make moves to make people feel genuinely valued for their creative autonomy. And I think that sits behind playfulness is maybe the mood that you want to inculcate in certain areas of your organization. Creativity is the spread of ideas that comes out to be useful, adaptively useful. Innovation is their implementation. But talk about play, we talk about the health and wealth, personal wealth and spirit of the people that you're with in your companis and your entity that breaks bread together convivially. And I think that would be one of my messages to leaders, if were they willing to listen.
I think there will be some soon. Now, there's loads of what I want more to talk about on that, but we'll have to do it on different projects. I just want to get people to know you a little bit, so I'm going to ask you some annoying quick-fire questions,
Okay.
just to round us off. Just the top thing that comes to your mind. What do you think is overhyped right now?
Populist nationalism. You know, the idea that people are just scared of the future and will return to a security-oriented homeostatic state. Maybe I'm a fool, but I think I've read enough into the human scientific condition to know that that's not enough. This viewpoint, hold on to nurse for fear of something worse, will not persist.
Where do you go to feed your brain creatively?
I curate my social media very carefully. If I can get to Blackwell's in Edinburgh or Foyle's in London, I'm doing very well for an afternoon. Use my mobile phone to snap book covers without necessarily buying the books and get chased out of the bookshop often for doing so. And it's hanging out with musicians. First time I ever heard about Bitcoin was hanging out with musicians who were trying to make money out of it. So that would be my three sources.
Good, and this may be triggering based on what else I know is going on in your life just now, but what would 18-year-old you be most surprised by about you today? Oh, you do this because you're going through your archive right now, you said before this call, so this is relevant.
Yeah. I think you would be surprised at my nihilism, and in nihilism in the sense of I think one of the consequences of culture wars and woke culture, for some, not for others, and certainly for this white male right here, is sort of realizing what our mode of agency has wreaked upon the earth. So I think that's that melancholy. I think I find it a great input into the way I go about things and the way I think about things. So given how absurdly ready to go I was at 18, I would be surprised that I had this sort of slightly absurdist sense of reality. But I think the 18-year-old would recognize the kind of the idealistic activist's utopian desire to get beyond that. But I think he would say you're a bit mis, Pat.
Just two more. What are three things you could not live without?
That would be smartphone. That would be my Buddhist love Indra, and my brother, actually my musical brother, who is a genius and an underheralded genius. Those three.
And then the last one, on a scale of 1 to 10, how weird are you?
10.
I get the same answers. Thanks very
12.
much, Pat.
13.
That's a great way to end. Thanks so much, Pat. That's really interesting.
Thank you, 14.
So concludes another episode of Label Sessions Presents. Be sure to follow and subscribe to the podcast no matter your platform of choice, and of course, start your journey today with us at labelsessions.com.